Hi there, and welcome back to IV Tutor. We are looking at the model view programming section. And in this video, we want to look at a few exam type questions. And before we continue, there's a handout with all these questions and the actual answers. If you go in your memos folder and you go model view programming handout, whatever, something like that, you can use the PDF with the actual full answers. So the purpose of this is not to give you the full answers, is to explain how to answer these questions and how you get to the answer and illustrate that it's not a very difficult topic. With enough practice, you can actually answer these questions easily because most of them are always the same questions. And before we start answering these questions, I want you to understand one thing. Every semester, they give you an assignment on the model view framework, right? And they choose one model that you use. So there are two types of questions you're going to get here. You're going to get general questions on the MV architecture, and you're going to get model-specific questions, right? About the model that you use. So if you were using the Q standard item model, on top of these type of questions, you also have to understand how to answer questions regarding the Q standard item model. How do I define it? How do I set up my headers? How do I insert records? How do I remove records? How do I make it read only? How do I make it editable? All those things you have to be able to do with a Q standard item model. And in the same way, if you are using Q abstract table view, understand how to implement a model. Understand which 3 functions must be implemented at least. Which 2 functions do I need to implement an editable model? If you're using a Q string list model, the same goes. Do you understand how to define the model? How do you insert data into the model? How do you sort items in the model? How do you make it editable? How do you make it read only? How do you delete items from the model? All those things are necessary because what I've seen is in the exam, they don't just give you questions about any model because, it will be a lot more preparation for you to understand how to implement and use all models. So in every semester, there's just going to be one model that you use. So when it comes to model-specific questions, you have to understand how to answer those. But in this video, we are only going to talk about the general questions that you can answer on the MV or MVC framework or MV framework as it is in QT. And like I said, you can download the handout with all these questions and answers in your under course resources in the memos folder. Yeah, somewhere there. If you don't see it, let us know, but it will be in there somewhere. So we want to discuss how to explain these questions and how to make sense of these questions. And then that's all we need to do now. So this is from the June 2013 paper, and it says, explain the main components of the MVC pattern. Now, it's only 3 months. All you have to do is, number 1, identify the 3 components and then give a brief description of what each component does. Like you've got the M, which is the model, the V, which is the view, and the C, which is the controller. The model represents your application objects, your view for presentation, and the controller controls data flow between the model and the view. Done. There's no paragraphs and explaining a lot of things. It's all straightforward. Explain 2 design benefits of applying the MVC pattern. So when it comes to design benefits, it's all about understanding the benefits of design patterns in general. If you know benefits of design patterns, those answers can work here. So things like code reuse, extensibility, and so on, all those answers can fit here. All you have to do is to explain if it's code reuse, how does the MVC pattern help you to reuse your code? If you talk about extensibility, how does it make it easier to extend your application? So these are very general questions that you should always have in the bank somewhere, like you should know. For instance, if you talk about code reuse, how does separating the model, the view, and the controller ensure that we can reuse our code? Which means if you want to display the same view in different places, you can just reuse exactly the same code. You don't have to duplicate that code. You can just reuse exactly that same view in many different places. That's an example. Or many views can actually use the same model. So I don't have to create a module for every single view that I want to use. So for every single time I want to display the same data, I don't have to duplicate that model. I can just use one model, reuse it everywhere else, right? List 3 different views offered by the MV framework. And that's very easy. Q table view, Q list view, and Q tree view. Right. So these questions are usually very straightforward. Here's another one. The MVC design pattern is an incredibly common pattern and is often suggested as the design principle for designing a software. What is a design pattern, and give one of its benefits? This is just a general question. What is a design pattern, and give one of its benefits? I don't think we have to explain anything there. It's just a very straightforward question. You go through the handouts or the so design patterns are proven efficient ways of problem solving, right? One of its benefits, again, benefits of design patterns is actually the same as this 5.2 question. What are the benefits of applying design patterns? Describe what is understood by the term anti-pattern. So this is not really part of the MVC, and there's already a handout. We normally talk about anti-patterns during our OOP questions, but again, you can go, there's a handout on anti-patterns. Let me just say this whilst we're here, that you also need to go and download. I think it's under general notes. There's an anti-patterns PDF. It's a one-pager. You must download that and go through those anti-patterns, like your interface plot, your code object, your input class. All those anti-patterns must be known. So this is beyond the scope of this video. We will not talk about that. Describe the MVC design pattern. So when you see a question that says describe the MVC design pattern, you're not doing much. What is M? What is V? What is C? It's exactly the same question as the one that we saw before, which wants you to explain the meaning, explain the main components of the MVC design pattern. So just list the components and explain or give a brief description of what each component is. These questions, you don't have to go miles trying to explain the MVC pattern. It's M, what is V, what is C, and we're done, right? How does the controller part of the MVC pattern compare with the way the Qt framework handles MVC approach to software design? So this is one of the most common questions that I've also highlighted when we were going through an overview of the MV framework. And you compare, a controller is always compared to a delegate, right? So whenever you are trying to compare MVC and MV and you don't mention delegates, you haven't said anything. And we said your delegate is equivalent to a controller because it sits between the model and the view. It is used for rendering items on the for editing on the view. It's also used for handling data updates from the view and updating the model. So in other words, a delegate sits between a model and the view. It controls data flow between the model and the view. Therefore, it can be seen as equivalent to a controller. So in other words, the MV approach or Qt handles a controller part using delegates. That is all you want to say there. And delegates sit between the model and the view, and they control data flow between those two objects. Now, what are the differences between the Q abstract item list model and Q standard item model? Whenever you compare models, there are two main aspects that we mentioned that you need to be able to compare. The type of data that you are going to use with that model, and number two, whether it's concrete or it's concrete or abstract. Those are the main two things you need to compare. How is it used? And here they say in terms of using them and the data structure that they can work with. So the question also went ahead and gave you those two hints, right? So in terms of using them, how would you use a Q abstract list model? You have to inherit or you have to subclass the Q abstract list item model and then provide an implementation of this model by implementing the three functions or the five functions that are required, which is your set data function, your data function, your row count function, your flags. Yeah, there are about five functions: set data, row count, flags, and I think there's the header data function. So these are about those five functions you have to always provide implementation for, depending on whether you are implementing a read-only model or not. Otherwise, you have to inherit from the Q abstract list model and provide your own implementation. And the abstract list model is used for list data, right? The Q standard item model is a concrete model, which means you just need to instantiate and use it. And it's meant for hierarchical or tabular data, right? That is your Q standard item model. This one says, explain the three main components of the MVC page. And again, the same question back. Qt includes delegates as part of its model view framework. Explain the use of delegates in the Qt implementation of the model view framework. Again, this is not really comparing MVC to MV, but it's simply saying, what do we use delegates for? And we say they're used for rendering items for editing. They're used for rendering or styling or controlling the way items are displayed on the view, and so on. So we've talked about delegates in the other video. We go through the overview of delegates of the MV framework. So you can also go and check that out if you haven't. Otherwise, that's delegates for you. And we said a delegate is equivalent or can be seen as equivalent to a controller in the MVC framework. Right. And in here, this one says, how would QList widget, a convenience class, differ from QList model in terms of a model view approach? So we did say that when we went through the model view framework, you've got two main categories. You've got model-based views, and you've got item-based views, or sometimes also referred to as convenience classes. And we said convenience classes or item classes, widget item classes are combine model and views, the module functionality and view functionality into one class. So they are less flexible, whereas model-based classes separate the model and the view. And the question is saying, how would these differ? So with a QString list model, you have to use a QList view, and it's a model-based approach, which means the data is separated from its presentation. A QList widget combines both the model and the view into one class. In other words, data is not separated from its presentation, and also it's less flexible, right? Let's talk about this one. It could be argued that the approach being used here follows the MVC. So there was I think before this question, you were required to implement or to write some code about the Q standard item model. So the questions from 2.1 to 2.3 were about how to implement, or how to use rather, the Q standard item model. So when they say it can be argued that the approach being used here, they are referring to the Q standard item model questions prior to 2.4, right? So in other words, they're referring to the MV framework approach in Qt. So here they are saying it can be argued that this approach follows the MVC approach, indicates to what extent you would agree by explaining the various roles in the MVC. So what do you have to do first? Explain the various roles in the MVC approach as they are implemented in the Qt framework using examples from the code given above. So you obviously throw in some examples from the question that from 2.1 to 2.3. But the core of this question is to identify that what is the MVC? You've got your model, your view, and your controller. So your model is used for handling data, just like in the Qt framework. A model is also used for providing an interface to the data. Your view in MVC framework is used for presentation, just like in the Qt framework. It's also used for data presentation and editing. And then the view and then the delegate in the Qt framework can be seen as equivalent to the controller in the MVC framework. And then explain the same way, because the delegate sits between the model and the view. It controls data flow between the model and the view. And you can explain what the delegate does briefly there if you want. But that is basically what this question is talking about, right? 2.5, give one benefit of the MVC approach as it would apply to this specific scenario. So when we talk about benefits of MVC, you can pick any of the benefits of design patterns. For instance, code reuse, and you can explain that one. How would using a Q standard item model differ from using Q table widget? Indicate how the difference would apply to both the components. So this question is exactly the same as this question. The only difference being that here you are using a QList widget versus a QString model. Here you are using a Q standard item model versus a Q table widgets. And the main difference is how the difference would apply to both components. In this case, you have to use the model with a view. In this case, It's an item-based class, which means it combines both the model and view functionality. Less flexible because data is not separated from its presentation, unlike in this case. So that is how you would explain this kind of a question. And again, before I move forward, the answers that I gave you in the handout for these questions, don't claim them, just be able to explain them. And that is the purpose of this video, to make you understand where those answers are coming from. So it's not about claiming like there are so many different ways of saying exactly the same thing. And I'm just here giving you a guideline, right? So just to be very clear that you've got leeway here in terms of explaining or answering these questions, as long as you stay within the concept. Right, this one says, Qt's approach to MVC design pattern is model view programming. Briefly describe Qt's model view architecture by referencing to the MVC design pattern and how the handling of the user interface is managed. One other important thing that you need to mention both in this question and in this question is the relationship between MVC and MV. MVC, model view controller, MV, model view. You have to also mention the fact that in the model view architecture, the view and the controller are combined together to form the MV. That is how we end up with the model view programming if you are going to explain it in reference to the MVC design pattern. So the MV framework is formed by combining the view and the controller in the MVC pattern. Now, instead of having a controller, we have a delegate in the MV programming framework. So that is the approach you want to take when answering this question, okay? The combination of the view and the controller to form MV and the presence of a delegate instead of a controller in the MV pattern. This here is a general question. Consider the following advantages of the MVC. Now, these are answers to some of the questions we were seeing before that we were saying, what are the benefits of applying the MVC pattern? Extensibility, maintainability, reusability, extensibility, the easiness of extending your application, maintainability, how easy is it to maintain your application, reusability, code reuse. Now, discuss each of these advantages. Your discussion should indicate an understanding of the MVC pattern and why it provides these particular advantages. So when it comes to extending your application, you just have to explain that in reference to the MVC. For example, if we want to increase the number of views for that same data, we just don't need to touch the model. We simply can use the same model and various views, right? Maintainability, how easy is it to maintain an application that follows MVC? The separation of responsibilities makes it easier to identify problems. If our problems are with presentation, we don't have to touch the controller, we don't have to touch the model, we just have to go and look at what's happening in the view. If our problems are data related, we have to go and touch the model and we leave the view and the controller. So it makes it easier to identify problems because of the separation of responsibilities. Reusability, how would you, a model can be reused for different views, right? And so on and so on. So you have to explain these things with regard to MVC. That's all you're doing there. Then discuss Qt's approach to the MVC design pattern. This question is almost exactly the same as this pattern. Like we have MVC, so how does Qt do it? We combine the V and the C and we form the MV framework. And in the MV framework, we don't have a controller, we've got a delegate, and then you can explain it whichever way you want. But those are the main core points you should bring out when explaining Qt's approach to the MVC design pattern. And the delegate is or can be seen as playing the role of a controller. Another point you can also mention that is already in the handout is the fact that the model view control, the delegate, model and view automatically respond to events that are happening in each other, right? That is also quite important in explaining your answers. Distinguish between Qt's abstract, concrete, and convenience classes found in its model view implementation, include how, where, and when these are used. So this then gives you the guide of how you explain such a question. How, where, when, right? So if we talk about abstract classes, how you inherit from them, right? When would you want to use an abstract class? When you want to provide I think this goes back to the other video where we said you can implement your model that is more features like lazy loading or lazy fetch, right? Or you are dealing with sparse data structures, right? So that is when you might want to implement an abstract, to implement your own model inheriting from an abstract class to provide better performing models, right? And then when we use a concrete, if I'm dealing with small-ish data sets, I can use a concrete model like the queue from that item model, because it's easier to use. How would you use it? By simply instantiating it. Or if you want to inherit, you can inherit and maybe override one or two functions, but you simply have to instantiate and use the classes because they are concrete. And then widget classes, these ones are used for very maybe simple applications because they combine the functionality of the model and the view, which means they are less flexible and would be used for very simple to small applications dealing with smaller data sets because of their less flexibility. And how would you use it? They are all concrete classes, so there's no need for inheritance. You simply use them as they are. So those are the main points that you need to bring out when explaining a question like 2.4. Okay. The MVC pattern can be seen as an application of another design pattern. Which one? And again, we've talked about this one before, and we said it's the implementation of the observer design pattern. This was just one mark. They wanted the name of the design pattern, but this one goes into detail and says, how would you see it as an implementation of the observer design pattern? So this one says, when writing event-driven programs, GUI views need to respond to changes in the state of data model objects so that they can display the most up-to-date information. When any data model object changes state, it needs an indirect way to alert and perhaps send additional information to observers. Observers are objects that are listening to state change events. A design pattern which enables such a message passing mechanism is called the observer design pattern, sometimes also known as the publisher subscriber pattern or publish subscribe pattern. There are many different implementations of this pattern. Some common characteristics that tie them together are they all enable concrete subject classes to be decoupled from concrete observer classes. So the classes that are creating the events are separate from the classes that are subscribing to those events. They all support broadcast style one-to-many communication. So you can have one class that is issuing out events and many classes responding to those events. For example, many views subscribing to one model. The mechanism used to send information from subjects to observers is completely specified in the subject's base class. And if we talk about Qt, we're talking about signals and slots. So the class that is emitting those events is the one that defines how observers will subscribe to it. So the signals would be obviously in the subject class, right? Now, use the given explanation of the observer pattern to answer the following questions. Explain the relationship between the observer pattern and the model view controller pattern. In the MVC pattern, what happens? You've got the model, the view, and the controller. They all respond to each other automatically, right? So in terms of the relationship between the observer, this question was actually quite simple to answer because you were given this, right? This was a very good guide to answering this question. The fact that you can decouple the classes, you've got a one-to-many relationship, and the subject defines the mechanism to send information. So in this case, the similarity then becomes, you can have one view and many models. You can have one model and many views rather. So many views can subscribe to more than one models. You can also, in the same manner, decoupling, the model, view, and controller are all decoupled from each other. In other words, data handling and presentation are all in separate classes. And finally, what else? Yeah, so you can talk about, and all three classes respond to each other automatically, which means As soon as there's an update in the model, the controller jumps in and the view is automatically notified of those changes. Third, one difference between the observer pattern and the model view controller pattern. When you look at the MVC and the observer, where is the main difference? The mechanism for communication is not only defined in the model, it's defined in all three classes. How does the Qt framework support MVC pattern? In the Qt framework, we've got the model view framework. So in other words, Qt combines the view and the C to form the model view framework, right? That is how the Qt framework supports MVC, because we don't have MVC in Qt, we've got the model view framework, not MVC, and which is formed by combining the view and the controller. Based on Qt's built-in model view classes, give an example of a concrete model class and a concrete view class, right? How is characteristic one listed in the given definition of the observer pattern applied in Qt's built-in model view classes? In other words, enable concrete subject classes to be decoupled from concrete observer classes. How is this pattern applied in Qt's built-in model view classes? So model classes are separate from view classes. So they are decoupled. You've got model classes and you've got view classes. So a view class is assigned a model that it should work with, but they are actually separate classes, right? So it was sort of like, to some extent, a self-answering question. How is decoupling applied in Qt's built-in model view classes? Because they are decoupled. Your model classes are decoupled from view classes. You've got model classes and then you've got view classes, and they communicate using signals and slots. That's how they then respond to each other. And you can give examples if you want. How is characteristic number 2 listed in the above definition of the observer? And number 2 now is the broadcast one-to-many. And you can also say, because one view can subscribe to many models. And also I think I would go, because many views can subscribe to one model, pretty much. So that is how that would be applied in the given definition. So this went more into detail on how the observer pattern is an implementation, on how the MV framework is an implementation of the MV or the MV pattern or the MVC pattern. So the MV and MVC are very similar, only that in the Qt framework, we don't have the C, we don't have the controller definition. But in the MVC, we've got the controller. But these two work more or less exactly the same way. So I think this provides you a basic understanding of the kind of questions you can expect under model view programming and how to answer them. You can go and download the handout if you want to see the actual answers I've put on these questions. Otherwise, that's it for the model view programming architecture. The other kind of questions that you get are model specific questions, and those you'll find not in this video. There will be I will try and put a different video for each of those models. But in our live classes, I think we do discuss the current model that we are doing for that semester quite a lot. So yeah, feel free to join us in our live classes on the platform, ivtutor.com. Otherwise, that's it from me. I'll see you again in other videos. Cheers.